Good day, economics students. Welcome to video number 2 of the economics perspective lecture portion of our learning. In video number 1 of the economics perspective, we covered the definition of economics. We reviewed the important idea of limited land, capital, and labor relative to unlimited economic wants, that resources are scarce, land, capital, and labor is scarce relative to the goods and services, the needs and luxuries that human beings desire. Therefore, we have what is known as the burden of scarcity. Because the burden of scarcity exists, we are forced to make choices. Every time we make a choice, there is a cost involved. We reviewed the important idea of rational behavior. As defined by Adam Smith, rational behavior acting in one's self-interest to maximize utility, the happiness, satisfaction, gratification that one receives from consuming a good or service or participating in some activity, engaging in some event. Now remember, these economic principles and concepts apply equally to all three components of society. Economics is a social science concerned with the most efficient use of society's scarce or limited resources, so rational behavior also applies to businesses and government, right? All economic principles and concepts apply to all three components of society. From rational behavior, we moved on to marginal analysis, right? Most decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. Most decisions in life involve changes in the status quo. You're participating in some activity, a business is engaging in some activity, the government is engaging in some activity. The question is, should we do a little bit more of that activity or a little bit less? We weigh marginal benefits versus marginal costs. So the next unit of production or consumption makes sense only if the marginal benefit, the additional utility that is derived from that activity, is greater than or equal to the marginal cost, right? From there, we moved on to incentives, and the idea that incentives matter, and changing the rules of engagement will change human behavior. Incentives matter. And finally, we talked about economic events creating secondary effects. It is important that you start to think of these principles and concepts known as the economics perspective as a mindset. They're not mutually exclusive where you pull a certain tool out of the economics toolbox for one specific problem or issue. All right, so rational behavior works along with marginal analysis and incentives and economic events creating secondary effects. We're building an entire mindset, an entire thinking process, the entire perspective of an economist. And the next concept in that toolbox of concepts is opportunity cost. In our mindset of thinking like an economist, opportunity cost. We talked about opportunity cost in statement number 3 of Do You Think Like an Economist? The next best alternative, the idea that there is no such thing as a free lunch. What one must forego whenever they consume some good or service or participate in some activity, right? The next best alternative, what was the next best thing we could have done with our time? Statement number 3, the main cost of having children is the food, shelter, clothing, and other things parents have to buy for them. No, the main cost of having children is the time that one gives up. Remembering that there's always a cost. If there's a cost to having children, then there's a cost to not having children. And that was all of the wonderful experiences that a person receives when they're a parent, right? The main cost of going to college is tuition, room, and board. Well, it turns out that the main cost of going to college is much broader than that. The main cost of college could involve lost wages and lost work experience, right? If there's a cost to going to college, then by default there's a cost to not going to college. Lost educational experience and lost socialization that you get to receive when you're in college. And then, of course, economic advantage of a college degree when you talk about occupational success over a lifetime, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. We will discuss throughout the remainder of this course opportunity cost. This principle or concept will be reviewed over and over, and we'll talk about it as it relates to a business. We'll talk to it as it relates to government issues. Remember, put a star next to this idea. There is always a cost, right? Matter of fact, you should start to apply this type of logic to your everyday thinking. There is always a cost. When you think about what decision you're making, there's always a cost. Even simple things like, hey, if I go out on Friday night, right, that leaves me less time to work on projects for school the following week, right? Maybe you have plenty of time, so maybe the cost isn't that great by going out Friday night. But if you go out Friday and Saturday night, right, there may be a greater cost. Start thinking as an economist. Everything has a cost. Little exercise that is useful to review. Do you understand the principle of opportunity cost? So you have just entered four-year university as a freshman. Your school, your college or university is 4 hours from your home. When you arrive on campus, you need a backpack. You need a backpack. The backpack is for the one that you desire to purchase is for sale in the campus bookstore for $80. The same exact backpack is in stock and ready to go down the street at the local shopping center for $70. You don't have an automobile on campus, so you need to take campus transportation. You got to grab the shuttle, travel down to the store, jump into the store, bring the item to the cashier, jump back on the shuttle, and return to campus. The round trip will take you 40 minutes. So the question is, do you go through the bother of making the 40-minute trip to save $10 on the backpack? Do you go through the bother of making the round trips 40 minutes to save $10 on the backpack? Well, when I'm teaching this in person, there's a class of, say, 30 people or more. Generally speaking, 3 to 5 people, a small percentage, believe it's worth their time, 40 minutes, to make the trip, round trip, to save $10. Now, I always kind of think that $10 was a lot of money to me when I was a college student. And if you think about it in terms of 40 minutes, right? If I was making $10 in 40 minutes, that means I'm making $15 an hour, right? Because 40 is 2/3 of an hour, right? So that's like making $15 an hour. I would do, that's a pretty healthy wage, making $15 an hour. Then I say to the same students, what about $20? Who would do it for $20? Make the 40-minute round trip to save $20. And then, of course, a few more hands will go up. And then I finally say, all right, what about $30? And then most hands will go up. Most people acquiesce at $30. They believe it's definitely worth their time, 40 minutes round trip to save $30. So the backpack is for sale for $50 at the off-campus site rather than $80 on campus. And then I say, okay, everybody put your hands down. I say, what about a tablet? What if the tablet is $1,000 at the campus store and $970 off-campus store, off-campus site? Interestingly enough, even the individuals who said they would go to the bother of the 40-minute trip to save $30 on the backpack now decide that it's not worth it because the item has a higher starting price. That is the wrong decision if you're an economist. Here's why. What are we measuring? We're measuring the next best alternative. What's the next best alternative? It's a question of how much money you save versus how long it will take you to save the money. The starting price of the item is irrelevant to the decision, or at least it should be to an economist. Now, if you were thinking as I was going through this, oh, I wouldn't do it to save $30 on an item that cost $1,000, you shouldn't feel bad. As a matter of fact, even economists get this question wrong when proposed to them in, say, a seminar, right? But it's important to start to try to accurately measure the next best alternative. Start the process of thinking like an economist. Speaking of thinking like an economist, part of our economics perspective builds on what is known as the economics methodology. First, economic terminology. Economists will use words, phrases, terms that you have heard in some other capacity in your life completely different than you are familiar with. And you have to be aware of this, because if you're unaware of this, you may be lost or not understand what's being discussed. Let me give you an example. If you pick up the Wall Street Journal and on the front page it said, investment spending fell by 0.25% in the first quarter of 2020. To the non-economist, they read that statement, they say, investment, that must be people buying stocks or bonds, right? But that's not what an economist means by the term investment. Right? To an economist, investment refers to a business purchasing machine, equipment, tools, building a factory, expanding plant capacity, right? Capital investment spending. Now, there will be times when we use investment as the traditional investment. In other words, when we look at, say, a stock or a bond, and we'll talk about. So you know that the term has two meanings, but you have to be careful that you understand what the economist means by the term investment. And there are many instances where economists use terms differently than the average everyday person. Just be aware as we go through our study that you familiarize yourself with the unique interpretation of familiar terms where economists use words differently than the average everyday person. All right, generalizations. Economists have the difficult task of trying to make sense of the real world. Economics is a social science. It's not chemistry. It's not biology. In chemistry, you can perform an experiment, then you can check it again, and then you can run it through the lab a third time, and you can verify your results over and over, and you will get the same exact outcome with some type of chemical experiment. Matter of fact, right, your results would not even be accepted in the scientific community unless you could verify your results more than one time. Economists are working with people in the everyday business of life. Not everyone will act the same way. So to make sense of the world and to start to build models that represent the world, economists use what's called generalizations. For instance, we know that generally speaking, right, and by generally we mean tendencies of the norm, what most people will do in this situation. If there is a recession or an economic downturn and individuals who are working receive a tax cut, they're going to spend most of that money. They're going to spend a good deal of that money. Now, there will be a frugal Frank and a Sally Saver that doesn't spend any of it, but 87% of people will spend, if not all of it, a good portion of the money. So if we were trying as economists to determine or decipher how the tax cut would help revitalize, reinvigorate the economy, then we would say, well, people on average would spend most of this. So if the tax cut was collectively for 150 million working people, let's say then it works out to be $100 billion tax cut collectively. We'll say, well, how much will that injection of $100 billion tend to increase spending, assuming that most people will spend the money, generally speaking, right? Number 3, ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus, other things equal. The Latin phrase here, other things equal. Remember, economists do not have the luxury of sitting in the lab and isolating one variable and holding it steady, still, in place, while all other variables are being investigated, or holding a series of variables in place while one variable is investigated. Economists have to deal with people in the everyday business of life. So, as a starting point in economic thinking, economists have to assume that all other variables in an equation are not moving. So, for instance, how will interest rates, a decrease in interest rates, affect business investment, gross business investments? Now, we just learned that investment meant when a business, whether it's a small, medium-sized, or multi-billion-dollar corporation, spends money on machines or plant capacity or some type of new equipment that is used in their productive process. So generally speaking, businesses finance these type of purchases. They borrow and then make the investment expenditure. So lower interest rates should stimulate that type of spending. So other things equal, in other words, if nothing else changed, if nothing else in the macro picture, if nothing else in the big picture, if nothing else in the economy changed, lower interest rates should increase investment spending. Now, you might be thinking, but what if something else changes? Well, we know things would change. So for instance, what if the economy had slipped into a severe downturn and businesses didn't have a significant demand for the good or service? Then they would say, well, even if interest rates are extremely low, it doesn't make sense for us to expand our plant capacity at a time when the economy is not doing all that well, when the economy is performing poorly. But as a starting point, other things equal is a necessary assumption. If we want to investigate the economic effects of one variable, we have to assume that all other events, all other variables for the moment, are not changing. Economic models and graphical expressions. Okay. Economists build models to make sense of the real world. The value of a model is only how accurately it can predict what will happen in actual events. A model is useless if it has no real world application, right? So when economists build models, they use graphs. And graphical expressions are tools that economists employ to make sense of and predict and to try to decipher and figure out what's going on from both a macro sense, the big picture, and a micro sense, a small picture, right? However, it's impossible to put every single solitary variable into the equation, into the model, into the graphical expression. So for instance, if you were driving your automobile from Pennsylvania to California and you were not permitted to use GPS, you would bring with you a map, right? A map would be a useful tool. Now, on the map, it's not going to have every fast food restaurant, every gas station, right? Every convenience store, every Walmart. If you need one of those places, you'll figure it out, right? It doesn't need to be on the map for the map to have value. You can think of economic models and graphical expressions in the same manner. A graphical expression in an economic model will have all the necessary information, understanding that we can't represent everything in the real world. The field of economics, the study of economics, is broadly divided into microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics is an investigation into the individual decision makers, the individual behavior of certain components within the larger economy. So a topic in microeconomics might be something such as the example here, the computer industry might just be investigating the computer industry. A popular topic of microeconomics is competitiveness in certain industries. One of the major topics of microeconomics over the last 3 to 5 years is the competitiveness of technology and the tech industry, because the likes of Microsoft, Google, Apple, and Facebook have grown so powerful. As opposed to microeconomics, macroeconomics investigates the economy in totality, in the aggregate, in the whole, the big picture. So microeconomics, the individual components and decision makers within the economy. Macroeconomics, a look at the big picture in the aggregate, the economy in totality in the whole. So economic output for an entire country, aka GDP. Unemployment for a nation, price level, also called the consumer price index. The balance of trade, exports versus imports. Something like the federal budget, right? Monetary and fiscal policy. So a statement of macroeconomics, GDP grew at 2%. Now, these two broad fields within the study of economics, they're not mutually exclusive, right? Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Apple, ginormous companies and represent a significant portion of our economy. So don't think that a topic is exclusively micro or exclusively macro. There can be overlap between the two. Now that we made the distinction between micro and macroeconomics, we need to talk about the difference between positive and normative economics. There is never an argument about positive economics. Positive economics is simply a statement about or a observation of absolute facts. So for instance, the unemployment rate is 5% now. Right now, the unemployment rate in the United States is much greater because it has gone up exponentially since COVID-19 and the pandemic and the economic fallout of the crisis. I can say definitively that prior to the pandemic in March, prior to this shutdown of the economy and our attempt to reopen, that the unemployment rate was at a 50-year low. That is a true statement. It's an absolute fact. There's never any argument about positive economics. Normative economics, opinion-based, what ought to be, right? So there's an example of this type of economic statement here. This is the worst job market in 30 years. That's an opinion. There is sometimes a fine line between positive economics and normative economics. When you read Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Economist, when you watch reports about what's going on with the healthcare industry or the debate about China and the trade deficit the United States has with China, or the idea that big tech is growing too powerful in the United States. Be careful, because economists who are trained understand how to include their normative ideas framed around positive economic facts. Okay? And as you can imagine, most debate is about normative economics. We could have two extremely educated, well-respected economists who have the exact same facts and figures in front of them about something such as income distribution in the United States, and they will argue completely different sides on what the best policy maneuver would be to address this particular economic concern. Positive versus normative economics. This concludes the second video of the economics perspective. Be with you shortly in video number 3 on the economics perspective.